Hello everybody, I'm Gary Lane, the Managing Director of Cyest Technology. I'm going to be showing you a model that was built for the South African Institute of Mine and Metallurgy conference. It was the Value Chain Optimization conference held in Johannesburg in May 2013. This model basically supports a paper that was done which is called a framework to simplify the management of throughputs and constraints, and this paper is actually available on our website www.cyesttechnology.com or our download site. Instead of just doing a normal presentation, I decided to actually demonstrate through a real model all the concepts of value chain optimization and incorporating the theory of constraints with regards to modeling of a value chain in mining. So this model basically consists of the following activities. It's got drill and blast, load and haul, crushing and processing. Those are the four activities that are built in this model. And really what I wanted to demonstrate is the dynamics related to the consequential downtime and the impact that consequential downtime has on each activity throughout the value chain, and the degree of coupling with regards to each activity and the stockpiles between them. The impact of ore characteristics, particle size distribution and blending, and the impact that has on each of the activities hasn't been modeled. That could obviously be very easily modeled as well, but for this model I didn't incorporate it. We could easily in future do that. So the first thing I wanted to show on the next slide was that there's really, at a very high level, we want to improve a mine. There's only two basic things you can do. So on the right hand side, what I've got here is I've built a cost curve. The mine that I've built, this hypothetical mine, sits here on the cost curve. The x-axis is the volume and the y-axis is the unit price or unit cost of the operation. Both of these are the same in terms of their position. I want to show you the impact of cost reduction and production improvement it have on this operation relative to all its other operations or other mining companies in this industry. So there's two basic things you can do. You want to improve this mine. What do you do? Well, I can reduce my absolute operating cost. Now that's not unit cost. Unit cost is driven off of a change in volume as well. This is just absolute cost. So let me reduce cost by 10%. Now watch the chart on the bottom here and see where my red line moves to. So I'm reducing it by 10%. I built a lever here. And this is the improvement in profitability of this operation. 28 million of improvement. You can see where it moved in the cost curve. Now what I could do is say, well, instead of doing a 10% reduction in cost, let me improve my production by 10%. Let's see what happens. Now you'll see the same thing happen on this cost curve as well. I'm going to improve my production by 10%. And there you go. I get about a 36 million improvement in this operation's profit. Interestingly, the cost reduction, even though it generated far less profit, reduced you further down the cost curve. So it's a cheaper unit cost operation, but this operation yields more profit because of the volume increase. Now this mine, obviously relative to the margin, each of those levers has a different level of sensitivity. In this operation, production improvement had a bigger impact than cost reduction, and as the margin of the mine would get bigger and bigger, the impact of production improvement is bigger and bigger. Now it just demonstrates that generally you'll find in most operations that are not marginal is that a production improvement generates a lot more value add than a cost reduction, and it's obviously a lot easier to generally find a whole lot of initiatives to improve production output as long as there's obviously the demand. So now let's go into this model and let's look at how you'd go about playing with levers to improve the production throughput of this operation to yield this additional value. First of all, I want to explain what the concept is of a value driver tree, or a VDT. A value driver tree is really just a visual representation of an underlying model of all the variables of the business. So here I've got a value driver tree for hauling. It shows all the variables that make up hauling rate. Now let's just drill in and have a look here. So I've got tons hauled. Tons hauled is made up of the fleet operating hours multiplied by the tons per hour. The fleet operating hours is the fleet size times the operating hours per piece of equipment. And then underneath that operating hours is your traditional time model. The available hours, utilized hours. Every operation has a different time model. In this instance then it's scheduled hours, planned and unplanned maintenance. And your unutilized hours as consequential delays, internal delays, external delays. And for example, in internal delays, you'd have shift change time, refueling time as an example. All depends on what information is available in the fleet management system. and what data we can get hold of, or how that the time model on that particular operation is modeled. And then in the tons per hour, it's your average payload times your fill factor and the capacity of the truck. Fill factor is a very, very critical parameter. It's how much you utilize in the capacity of, for example, in hauling of the truck. And often it's a very under-measured and under-managed variable. I mean, that truck, when after it's been hauled and goes off on its cycle time to tip, needs to be utilizing its full capacity as far as possible. Average cycle time made up of spotting time, loading time, empty time, the distances hauled when empty, for example, and that type of thing, all again in the time management system. So this is what's termed a VDT. It's a value driver tree. Underneath each of these is a formula. So you can see tons hauled is actually fleet hours times tons per hour. The tons per hour is your average payload, average cycle time divided by 60. All the different formulas that make up a model of this business. So now let's see, how would we go about using this model? I want to demonstrate a few very key concepts. So let's first of all look at one individual activity. So let's look at a typical generic activity and how all the activities in this model have been produced or have been modeled. So in its most basic form, any activity can be modeled as quantity produced times production rate times net production time. So it's basically how much you're doing per hour times number of hours. Now that's not just for mining. You can in fact apply it even to something in banking, where the number produced is the number you can produce per hour times the number of hours that you're actually working. Now let's look at the net production hours. It's made up of your available time times your operating delays. Available time is made up of scheduled hours. That's the number of hours that this operation is operating. So if it's continuous operations, it would be probably 365 days a year minus public holidays, minus added downtime multiplied by hours per day. Maintenance downtime, which consists of planned and unplanned. And then operating delays, which is made up of internal delays, external delays, and consequential delays. Now I want to just dwell on these for a second. Internal delays is that activity is holding itself up. So for example, it's a truck. It's been maintained, it's up and running, it's available to operate, but you're not utilizing the available time because there's an operator not available to operate the truck. That would be an internal delay. An external delay would be something that's external, that's causing that activity not to perform. So an external delay would be things like maybe a labor strike, or maybe there's an electricity outage, or there could be some other external factor associated with the mine that's causing that activity not to operate. It's not being held up by downstream and upstream activities. That would be consequential delays. So consequential delays means I'm a hauling activity. I'm available to operate, but my load is not available to load the hauler or haul truck, and that's being starved of material, or hauling is available to operate. It's got material, it's loaded, but it can't tip into the crusher, and then you'd be choking that activity. So in reality, depending on the time model, in most instances this is not captured very well in most time models. There are only 4 pieces of information that are needed, and you only need to capture it when an activity is not actually operating. So it's not actually that complicated. And that is internal delay. Am I holding myself up? An external delay, well, is something else holding me up that's not related to the value chain. And then consequential should just be broken up into, am I being choked of material, meaning the activity that feeds me is not feeding me, or am I being starved, am I not being fed material, or choked, I can't feed material. If you have those 4 pieces of information, you can model this value chain and do proper optimization of the value chain utilizing the full theory of constraints. What I want to show you here is an interesting concept. In this model, we've got quantity produced, which is 108,000 tons. There's the formula again. You can see the formula. Production rate times net production time. And consequential delays of 65 hours. So this activity has 140 hours of downtime. Interesting, 65 of them are internal delays. It's holding itself up. External delays of 10, and it's being held up by 65 hours of consequential downtime. So if we had to make this 0, let's say this activity wasn't being held up. This activity could actually do 127,000 tons versus 108,000 that's actually doing. Now, this is an important concept. We call it internal capacity. It's a very important concept I'd like you to remember, because I'm going to refer to it later on in the model. It's basically what this activity could do if it's available to operate. It's not being held up by anybody starving it or anybody choking it, but it is being impacted by its own internal and external delays. So that would be internal capacity. So let's move on now and have a look at when these activities are interconnected. So basically that I just showed you is the underlying model for each of these activities. But in reality, these activities are now linked together. That consequential downtime that I showed you is being caused by other activities up and downstream that are all impacting each other. So this loading and hauling activity is available to operate, but it's not being able to proceed because maybe drilling and blasting is holding it up, or it's able to operate but crushing is holding up. And that is how this model, the whole value chain is modeled, and the impact of theory of constraints applies then to this model. Now, if we just take one activity, so let's just take the hauling activity, or loading and hauling, and let's look at a sensitivity on just that activity, which is how mines traditionally operate, because there's a person who's responsible for this activity, and he worries about his biggest levers, not paying respect to the other levers and how the other activities are holding up. So let's have a look at a normal sensitivity analysis just on crushing. Sorry, it was just crushing. So if I change each of the levers that I showed you by 10%, what is the impact it has on that activity's throughput? So interestingly, a 10% impact change on scheduled hours has the biggest impact, as we would expect. That's why we do continuous operations. Production rate, second biggest. So this is the amount of extra production achieved by 10% change in scheduled hours, 10% change in production rate. A 10% improvement in unplanned maintenance, meaning you reduce unplanned maintenance, then has that impact. Planned maintenance reduction has that impact, and internal delays, this one. So it shows you want to improve crushing, there's your biggest activity. But now, what if we actually went and did the same analysis, but not within one activity being crushing? Let's pay respect to all of the activities and do that same sensitivity analysis across the whole model. Let's understand the biggest impact variable on the crushing throughput. So we do the same sensitivity analysis, and now very, very interesting. What's the biggest activity or biggest lever, value lever, with a 10% impact that can improve the crushing throughput? Number one, loading production rate. So the loading production rate has the biggest impact. It has an impact of almost 3,500 tons on the crushing throughput. Then the loading choking factor. So that's the choking factor applied to crushing from loading. Then the loading planned maintenance, loading internal delays, loading unplanned maintenance. Very, very interestingly, not a single crushing lever comes up in the top 10 of the top levers that impact crushing performance. And this is because the loading and hauling activity is actually the constraint based on theory of constraints. So this model just applies theory of constraints by the fact that we've just modeled it correctly. So now let's have a look at the overall throughput of the system just to demonstrate that. So what's interesting here, this is the internal capacity of each of the activities, that internal capacity that I explained earlier. That's the drill and blast internal capacity, almost 87,000 tons, loading and hauling 47, crushing 66, processing 65. That's what each activity can do if it's not been held up by the activity up or downstream. So loading and hauling, if it wasn't being held up ever by drill and blast, that's what it can do. If it was never held up by crushing, that's what it can do. But in reality, the system throughput is even lower than this loading and hauling. So in fact, the system only is doing about 34,000 tons per month compared to the constraint of 47, because even though this is this lowest constraint, or the static constraint, it is still being held up due to consequential downtime because of starving and choking of up and downstream processes. And that's really theory of constraints. Now let's do another piece of analysis. It's really called, in the technical term is called attribution analysis. We call it reason for variance. We use it a lot in our performance diagnostics product that we've built in Querent. And basically, I want to understand the biggest levers that will cause the variance between the system throughput and the highest this internal delay on internal capacity on load and haul. So let's look at the attribution analysis, and it's telling us where the biggest levers are is actually operating crusher maintenance downtime, then the drill and blast downtime, operating process maintenance downtime. So it's just showing you where the biggest opportunities lie in terms of delta between system throughput and internal capacity. So this is not a sensitivity analysis. It's a completely different analysis. It's talking about where the biggest impact is between system throughput and the lowest internal capacity. So now we want to go and apply some of this thinking to improvements in the system. So we've identified load and haul as being our constrained activity. It's the lowest activity. So we've got levers that we can adjust now. So we could probably do the following. We could look at reducing the internal delays on load and haul to improve its internal capacity or its availability to improve it. Or look at the upstream downtime. So if the drill and blast was more predictable and reliable and didn't cause consequential downtime, this load and haul would do more. Or there could be a bigger buffer. Now buffers are underrated. They are a big opportunity. The size of the buffer determines the overall system throughput, because that buffer can actually decouple activities so that the downtime on one activity is not impacting the other activity. Or you could have downstream downtime. So crushing's downtime could reduce to improve load and haul. And again, the buffer size here. So very, very interesting thing that we've modeled is, for example, in a lot of mines in open cast, you will tip straight into the crusher. And the finance guys will generally say, no, you can't double handle. You can't put a stockpile in front of the crusher and then double handle and have a loader loading the crusher. But in fact, if you look at the overall system throughput, by feeding a consistent stream of material into the crusher and then into processing, you generally get a far higher throughput of the system, even though you're paying for double handling. And the value add to the operation is significant compared to the double handling cost, which is often missed. So now let's go and do those improvements. So let's run those scenarios. So I've shown you the same thing again. Load and haul is my lowest activity at 47. It's my constraint. There's my system throughput of 34,000 kilotons per month. And I've just exposed 4 value drivers in this instant, just for this demonstration. I've got the starving factor, which is how I've mimicked the consequential downtime on load and haul, a choking factor, internal delays, and availability. So you could say, well, maybe the starving of load and haul by drill and blast could reduce maybe right down to 11%, and straight away you see the system throughput went up to about 38,000. My choking factor, meaning crushing's choking of load and haul, could actually be reduced as well. Look at that, we went up to over 40,000 straight away. Now we're finding on a lot of open cast operations, without spending a cent of capital and just looking at managing consequential downtime effectively between different activities, we can get in some instances a 25% improvement on system throughput, just looking at very simple things like shift changeover. Or even a very interesting one we found in most open cast operations is you've got a massive hauler, a massive Cat 777, and it doesn't operate because a operator is not available, and the operator might not be available because he's at training, or he's at a union meeting, or he's doing admin, or he's just on leave. And in some instances we found on a mine in a 2-year period that over the whole fleet it involved 19,000 hours of downtime, which equated to 2 billion rand of lost opportunity because the processing wasn't even at its full capacity, and it only worked out at 4 operators per month. And the GM of this particular operation said there's no way we can hire 4 extra operators, but because it looked like it was an extra cost, where there was a 2 billion rand of lost opportunity because of just 4 operators needing to be available. And what if the internal delays on load and haul were reduced as well, and improve the internal capacity? Then you'll see the internal capacity improving further as well. And then availability could also improve, which would also have a major impact. So at the end of the day, showing you there's some very, very simple things that could be done. We improve this operation's throughput just looking at loading and hauling, probably by over 15-16% here, just by looking at a couple of factors. So in conclusion on this model, to be able to prioritize business improvements and performance management decisions, you really need to look at the whole value chain and not just a single process, because Often these operations are busy fighting fires, and they've got long lists of initiatives at every single one of the activities in drill and blast, load and haul, crushing, processing. And in fact, there's only one activity that is the constraint at a given point in time, and you need to really focus on what are the priority items in that one, and really you can only do 3 or 4 things at a time, so focus those on the thing that has the biggest impact. Significant throughput optimization exists by modeling the mining value chain and taking downtime into account. And there's a lot of examples that I could give you from our experience of modeling a lot of open cost operations. The concept of internal capacity is a very valuable insight, and it gives you a very important view on what the static constraint is in the system. And a value chain model is a critical part of a business improvement and performance management process that's critical to an operation. And I think also performance management is really a continuous improvement mindset. So we really need to make continuous improvement part of ongoing normal performance management, because what I just demonstrated to you now could be done every single day to identify the system constraints causing you not to meet production targets in your operation, and to put proactively interventions in place every single day to yield the maximum out of your invested capital in your infrastructure. So thank you very much for this for the time. If you do have any more questions, feel free to have a look at our website or mail us at info@cyesttech.com. Thank you very much.